Imagine this. You're just trying to get through the busiest streets of New York, when you see a young girl standing alone, lost in the chaos of Times Square. But here's the twist. What if that girl who seems like a stranger suddenly calls you Mom? This is a story of a mother and daughter separated for years, reunited in the most unexpected way. But what happens next will completely shock you. Stick with me till the end because this reunion is not what you think. You won't believe how this story unfolds. Let's get started. Before we dive into this incredible story, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. And if you're enjoying this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one. It was a chaotic afternoon in New York City's Times Square. The air was thick with the energy of 1,000 voices, mingling with the honking of taxis and the soft hum of the subway underground. Bright, flashing billboards loomed overhead, advertising everything from Broadway shows to the latest tech gadgets, their neon lights fighting to be seen above the clutter of people on the streets below. The sidewalks were crowded with a mix of locals and tourists, each lost in their own world, walking with purpose or simply trying to take in the iconic sights of the city. In the middle of it all, Meryl Streep felt out of place. Though she was a seasoned actress, accustomed to the spotlight, the hustle and bustle of Times Square was something else entirely. Today, she wasn't here for a photo op or a red carpet event. She was here to experience the city on her own terms, hoping for a rare moment of peace. But the noise, the crowds, the overwhelming brightness, it all felt strangely alien to her. With her shoulders slightly hunched, Meryl's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the sea of people swarming every which way. She had walked this street before, but today was different. Today she was alone. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she wanted a few moments of quiet. But as she moved deeper into the heart of Times Square, a peculiar feeling settled over her, as if the city itself was conspiring to keep her lost. Just as she began to wonder if she'd ever escape the sensory overload, something caught her eye, something that broke through the chaos. A young girl standing all alone in the middle of the bustling street. Her face was streaked with tears, and she looked utterly out of place amidst the waves of people rushing by. Her small frame was dwarfed by the towering figures surrounding her, and it was impossible not to notice her. She was lost. Meryl's heart went out to her immediately. In that split second, everything around her seemed to blur. People rushing by, the neon lights flashing above, it didn't matter. She felt a sudden, overwhelming pull to help. Something about this girl's vulnerability in the middle of the madness stirred something deep within Meryl. Without thinking, she stepped toward her. "Hey, are you okay?" Meryl's voice was gentle, cutting through the noise of the city. She didn't want to startle the girl, but she couldn't just walk by. The girl looked up, her wide eyes red from crying. She took a hesitant step back as if unsure whether to trust the stranger. But after a moment's hesitation, she seemed to soften, lowering her arms to her sides. I can't find my mom," she whispered, her voice quivering. Meryl's heart clenched. Alone in a crowd that large, it must have felt like the world was closing in on her. Without hesitation, Meryl crouched down to the girl's level and offered her a comforting smile. "Don't worry, I'll help you find her," Meryl reassured her, reaching out a hand. For a moment, the girl just stared at Meryl, her tear-streaked face uncertain. But after a few seconds, she looked down at Meryl's hand and then, almost as if by instinct, took it. "Hey, are you okay?" Meryl asked gently, her voice cutting through the chaos of the street, a soft contrast to the blaring horns and the distant hum of the city. She crouched down slightly to meet the girl's gaze, her eyes full of concern. The girl, startled, looked up at Meryl, her large, watery eyes blinking rapidly as if she couldn't quite believe someone was actually stopping to help. She quickly wiped her tears with the back of her hand, but the red streaks on her cheeks were unmistakable. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, and her clothes were too big for her, as though she had been in a hurry or simply didn't know where she was. Her hair, a tangled mess, suggested that she had been wandering for a while, lost in the crowd, without a clue as to where to go or who to turn to. I can't find my mom," the girl said, her voice small and trembling, as if each word was a struggle to get out. Meryl's heart ached for her. It was the kind of loneliness that didn't belong in a place like Times Square. So many people around, yet no one to offer comfort. Meryl didn't hesitate. She smiled warmly, her voice steady and kind. "Don't worry, I'll help you find her." She extended her hand, the warmth of her gesture offering something beyond just reassurance. It was a promise. The girl hesitated for a moment, looking at Meryl's outstretched hand as if weighing her options. After a brief pause, she slowly took it. The girl's tiny fingers wrapped around Meryl's, and just like that, they were walking together through the crowd. Meryl could see the girl's nerves were still high, but she was trying her best to stay composed. Meryl wanted to make her feel safe, to ease the anxiety that seemed to cling to her. As they walked side by side, Meryl scanned the crowds, keeping a lookout for any sign of the girl's family. But she knew it could take a while. Times Square was a maze of flashing lights and endless rows of people, each in their own world. "So," Meryl said, trying to make conversation, "do you like to play pretend?" The girl looked up at her, clearly confused by the sudden change in tone. "Pretend?" she asked. "Yeah," Meryl continued, smiling brightly. "When I was your age, I always imagined I was a spy, trying to avoid the villains. I'd sneak around, hide in places, and see who could catch me." The girl seemed to process this for a moment, her expression uncertain. But then a small, tentative smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "I used to pretend I was a superhero," she said shyly, her voice still a little shaky. "I could fly and save people." "That's a great superpower," Meryl said with a wink. "You know, I think being a superhero is a little like being a good spy. You have to stay calm, think on your feet, and always be ready for whatever comes next." The girl looked up at Meryl again, this time with a spark of curiosity in her eyes. Her smile grew wider, and for the first time she seemed to relax a little. Meryl's words had broken through the tension, if only for a moment. She could see it now. The girl was starting to open up, trusting her if only a little. They kept walking, the crowd around them swirling in all directions, but the connection between them felt undeniable. For Meryl, the noise of the city began to fade into the background. All she could focus on was the girl beside her, the feeling that she was meant to be here, helping, guiding her through the madness. "Do you have any other superpowers?" Meryl asked with a grin, hoping to keep the mood light. The girl's face brightened, and she looked up at Meryl as if she'd just remembered something. "I can make people laugh," she said, her voice more confident now. "I tell jokes." "I'm sure you're really good at it," Meryl said, smiling back at her. "Maybe you could tell me one later. I could always use a good laugh." The girl's smile deepened, and for a moment, it felt like they were just two people, walking through Times Square, sharing stories and passing the time. But Meryl knew better. In the back of her mind, the search for the girl's mom was still the priority, the real reason they were walking together. But for now, she let herself enjoy the connection, the fleeting moment of peace they had found together in the heart of the city. As Meryl and the girl made their way through the crowded streets, the noise of Times Square seemed to swallow them whole. The flood of pedestrians pushing past, the clatter of subway trains beneath the pavement, and the relentless flashing of advertisements above them, it was all so overwhelming. But for Meryl, her focus was entirely on the girl beside her, and she did everything she could to keep the mood light. "So what's your name?" Meryl asked, her voice warm. She tried to catch the girl's gaze, but the child's eyes were still scanning the crowd, as if searching for someone familiar in the mass of strangers. The girl looked up at Meryl, her eyes still wide, but the fear had started to soften. "Lily," she said softly. "Lily Green. Lily, huh? That's a beautiful name. What do you like to do, Lily? Do you play any games or sports?" Meryl asked, trying to steer the conversation in a direction that might help the girl feel more comfortable. Lily shrugged lightly, her gaze still darting around. "I like drawing, and playing with my dog," she said, her voice a bit distant as though her thoughts were elsewhere. Meryl smiled, relieved to hear the girl's voice sounding more at ease, even if she still seemed a little withdrawn. "Do you like dogs?" "I have one, a little terrier. He's a troublemaker." Lily's lips twitched at the mention of the dog, but she didn't respond with much enthusiasm. Meryl decided to change the subject again, hoping to distract her further. "Have you ever been to New York before?" Meryl asked, looking down at Lily, who seemed slightly more engaged now. "No," Lily replied, her voice flat, and then added, "I always wanted to see the big lights." Meryl nodded, glancing up at the towering billboards flashing around them. "Yeah, there's something, aren't they? When I first came here I thought they'd never stop. But you get used to it, sort of." Lily didn't reply. Instead, she seemed lost in her own thoughts again. Meryl's curiosity began to grow, but the feeling of unease in her gut was impossible to ignore. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, something about the girl just didn't sit right. Maybe it was her calm demeanor despite being lost, or the way she seemed so distant in a place that should have felt overwhelming to a child. And then, as they were walking through a particularly busy intersection, Meryl heard it, so soft she almost missed it. "I'll be fine, Mom," Lily murmured under her breath, her words barely audible over the noise of the street. Meryl froze mid-step. Her heart skipped a beat, and the blood rushed to her ears, drowning out the sounds of the city for a moment. Did she just say what Meryl thought she'd said? Meryl glanced down at Lily, who was still walking beside her, her face impassive. "What did you just say?" Meryl asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but her stomach had already begun to twist with anxiety. Lily blinked, clearly confused by Meryl's reaction. "I said I'll be fine." "Mom?" she repeated, her voice slow and uncertain, like she wasn't quite sure if that was the right thing to say. Meryl's chest tightened, her heart now racing. "Mom?" The word echoed in her mind. Meryl's mind raced, trying to make sense of it. This couldn't be real, could it? There was no way this girl, this child she barely knew, was calling her mom. Meryl stood still for a moment, her hand still gently holding Lily's, the bustling world around them seeming to blur for a second. She looked down at Lily, studying her face, looking for any sign of recognition. But the girl's eyes were wide and innocent, filled with confusion more than anything else. She wasn't smirking or acting strangely, she was simply confused. Meryl's mind spun with 1,000 questions. Was it possible that Lily was just missing her mother so much she was imagining things? It was a thought Meryl clung to, desperate to make sense of the moment. Maybe the girl was so scared that she had latched onto the first comforting word she could find. Still, something in Lily's voice, so matter-of-fact as if she had been speaking those words her entire life, made Meryl's gut churn. There was an uncanny calm in her, something more than the usual uncertainty of a lost child. Meryl took a deep breath and forced a smile. "It's okay, Lily. We'll find your mom. Just hang on, all right?" Her voice came out steady, but inside the anxiety was rising, an unsettling feeling deep in her chest. Lily nodded, though she still seemed distant, her mind elsewhere. The pair continued walking through the chaotic streets, but now Meryl couldn't shake the feeling that something far more complicated was unfolding. As they moved through the masses, Meryl couldn't help but wonder, what was it about this girl? Was she really just a lost child in Times Square? Or was there something deeper at play, something Meryl couldn't yet understand? After what felt like hours navigating through the crowd, Meryl and Lily finally found a quiet cafe tucked away just off the main drag of Times Square. Meryl had managed to call the girls' parents using her phone, but as they waited for them to arrive, the unsettling tension still lingered in the air. Meryl tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She wasn't even sure what that feeling was, just a quiet, gnawing doubt that made her question every little interaction with the girl. Sitting across from Lily at a small table, Meryl watched the girl sip at her hot chocolate, her eyes scanning the room as if lost in thought. For the first time Meryl had a chance to breathe. She could feel the weight of the city outside, muffled by the soft hum of the cafe, but her mind was still racing. What was happening here? Was Lily really just a lost child, or was something else going on? The two sat in silence for a while, the clinking of cups and the murmur of other patrons filling the space between them. And then, just as Meryl was about to break the silence, Lily spoke. "You know, I really liked The Devil Wears Prada," Lily said casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to bring up. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the quiet of the cafe. Meryl's hand froze midair as she was about to take a sip of her own coffee. She blinked, unable to process what she had just heard. She lowered her cup slowly and turned to the girl. "The Devil Wears Prada?" Meryl asked, her voice betraying the confusion that swirled in her mind. The girl wasn't old enough to have seen the movie. She was barely 8, and yet there she was talking about one of Meryl's most iconic roles with the kind of detail that could only come from a true fan. "Yeah," Lily continued, looking directly at Meryl. "The scene with the blue sweater, your character was so strong. I liked how you knew exactly what to say to make people listen." Meryl's breath caught in her throat. That scene. The blue sweater. It was one of the most talked about moments in the film. It had become iconic, a symbol of Meryl's character's sharp, commanding presence. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. This girl, this child, was talking about her performance as if she had studied it, as if she were old enough to understand the complexities of the role. But she wasn't. There was no way. Meryl's hand trembled slightly as she placed her cup down on the table, her gaze never leaving Lily's face. "How do you know about that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the words were escaping her without her permission. There was a chill running down her spine now, a feeling she couldn't shake. The pieces didn't fit. Lily didn't miss a beat. She spoke in the same calm, almost detached manner, as though she had no idea that her words were anything but ordinary. "I know lots about you," Lily said, her voice nonchalant. "Like how you've always been a great friend to everyone." Meryl felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just some random child talking about a movie. This wasn't coincidence. Meryl had never met this girl before, but somehow she was talking about her life, her personal life, with an unsettling degree of familiarity. She had always been careful about keeping certain aspects of her life private, and yet here was Lily, speaking as if she'd been following Meryl's career for years, as though she had somehow been watching her every move. Meryl's mind reeled. This girl couldn't have known these things. How could she? Lily, Meryl said, trying to steady her voice. How do you know all this? About me? Lily simply shrugged as if the question wasn't worth much thought. I just know. Meryl's heart raced as she processed the weight of Lily's words. I just know. The way Lily spoke felt like she wasn't just some random child who had heard a few things about Meryl through casual conversation or the media. It felt as though she had known Meryl for much longer, had been watching her from the sidelines for far too long. Meryl's mind was spinning now, but her body remained still. She studied Lily, trying to see if there was any sign of recognition in the girl's eyes. But Lily's expression remained calm, almost too calm. The more Meryl thought about it, the more it bothered her. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a lost child in Times Square. Something was wrong. Lily looked up at her, her eyes wide and innocent. What's wrong, Mom? Are you okay? Meryl blinked, her heart nearly stopping. Mom. Again. That word. It echoed in Meryl's ears, and for a split second, everything around her seemed to blur. Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of it. Was this some kind of mistake? A coincidence? Meryl cleared her throat, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up her coffee again. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, Lily, she said, trying to sound more composed than she felt. I'm just trying to figure this out. But inside she knew something was very wrong. The pieces didn't fit. The girl was too young to know so much about her, and yet, here she was, speaking as if she had been a part of Meryl's life for years. Meryl felt her chest tighten as she fought to maintain control of the situation. But the more she tried to rationalize it, the more the unease crept in. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something much more complicated, and much more dangerous. Meryl's mind was spinning, her thoughts racing with questions that only seemed to lead to more confusion. She had tried to rationalize it. The girl must have seen The Devil Wears Prada somehow, maybe through a relative or a video. But no, it didn't make sense. No 8-year-old should know that much detail. No 8-year-old should speak with such familiarity, as if they had known Meryl for years. But before she could finish piecing together the puzzle in her head, the door to the cafe suddenly swung open. The soft chime of the doorbell barely registered as two figures entered. A man and a woman, both looking frantic, their eyes scanning the cafe with a kind of urgency that was hard to miss. They rushed in, their movements sharp, their faces drawn with worry. They must have been the girl's parents. Meryl's eyes flicked from the girl to the couple, her breath still shallow as she tried to wrap her head around everything that had happened. But before the parents could even speak, before they could call out or ask what had happened, the girl stood up from her chair, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Thanks for helping me, Mom, Lily said, the words slipping from her lips so naturally, it felt as though she had been saying them for years. Meryl froze. Time seemed to stop. The room went silent for a split second, the world around her fading into nothing. The words Mom echoed in her head, louder than anything she had ever heard before. Did she just say that? Meryl's heart stopped, her chest tightening as the blood rushed to her ears. Her mind was reeling. Had she heard that right? Was the girl talking to her? Her head spun, and for a moment she felt as though she were losing her grip on reality. The girl, this little girl, had just called her Mom. Meryl blinked rapidly, her eyes wide, trying to make sense of it. She turned her gaze back to the girl who was now standing there, her small form looking almost serene as though nothing was wrong. But Meryl's jaw dropped, her hands trembling, unable to process what was happening. The man and woman who had just entered the cafe now turned toward Meryl, confusion written all over their faces. They hadn't yet spoken, hadn't even had the chance to ask about their daughter, but now they were staring at Meryl, as if they had just discovered something they hadn't expected. Lily wasn't paying attention to them anymore, her eyes locked on Meryl's. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, as if waiting for Meryl to respond. Meryl's throat tightened and her voice barely escaped. I don't understand, she whispered, her mind a blur of disjointed thoughts. What did that mean? Why did she say that? Her heart raced in her chest, the air thick with the weight of the moment. The words didn't make sense, but the look in Lily's eyes, the certainty in the girl's voice, spoke volumes. This wasn't just a case of a lost child. Meryl's instincts screamed at her that there was more to this. She could feel it in her bones now, the connection, the inexplicable bond that had drawn her to the girl in the first place. Meryl stood still, paralyzed, as the parents rushed over to their daughter. The woman knelt down in front of Lily, her face filled with concern. "Lily, sweetie, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but frantic. Lily didn't even look at her parents. She kept her eyes locked on Meryl, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I'm fine, Mom," she repeated quietly, her voice calm, almost soothing. Meryl's mind couldn't keep up. She felt like the world around her was spinning out of control. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. She could barely breathe as the pieces that had been scattered throughout the day began to fall into place. But they didn't make any sense. How could this be? The man, now standing beside his wife, turned to Meryl with a confused look. "I'm sorry, but we don't know who you are." His voice trailed off, not sure how to handle the situation. Meryl's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to look at the parents, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know either," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But, she just called me Mom." The silence in the cafe grew thicker as the weight of Meryl's words settled over everyone. The parents exchanged confused glances, then turned back to Meryl, their faces pale and uncertain. "Mom?" the woman asked, her voice wavering slightly. She reached out for Lily's hand. "Sweetheart, what are you talking about?" Lily didn't answer. She didn't need to. The words had already been said, and they hung in the air, heavy with a truth that Meryl couldn't yet grasp. She felt an undeniable pull toward the girl, an overwhelming sense of recognition. Something deep inside her told her that this wasn't just a coincidence. This was fate. This was a reunion. But Meryl didn't know how. She didn't understand how. How could this little girl be hers? It didn't make sense, and yet, in that moment, nothing seemed to matter more than the girl standing in front of her, calling her Mom. The parents stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation dawning on them as they saw Meryl's confusion and disbelief. The woman, her face etched with both concern and something else, a quiet sadness perhaps, took a slow step forward. Her eyes softened as she locked gazes with Meryl, as though searching for the right words to bridge the chasm of years lost. Finally she spoke, her voice gentle yet firm, carrying the weight of a truth long hidden. "She's your daughter, Meryl," the woman said, her words slow and deliberate. "She's been living with us. After everything that happened, we thought it was safer for her. We thought you didn't remember." Meryl's mind snapped into overdrive. The room seemed to tilt beneath her, her surroundings growing distant, as though the very ground she stood on was no longer solid. Her thoughts began to tumble, crashing against each other in a chaotic storm. The woman's words struck her like a blow to the chest. Her daughter? But how? What did she mean by safer? Meryl's eyes darted to the girl, her daughter, who now looked up at her, those familiar eyes filled with knowing, silent recognition. They were the same eyes she had seen in her own reflection years ago. The face before her was so much older now, so much different, yet the resemblance was undeniable. This was her daughter, the child she had lost in the chaos of a messy, complicated family situation. And now here they were, brought together by what could only be described as an impossible twist of fate, in a city so vast, so full of strangers, that it seemed incomprehensible. But there she was, Lily, standing before her, the girl who had been ripped from her life, now returned. Meryl's heart clenched, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to speak, but the words seemed to catch on the edge of her tongue. "I had no idea," Meryl whispered, her voice trembling, barely able to control the surge of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I thought you were..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Her thoughts tangled into a jumble of half-formed memories, the years of loss and confusion coming back in waves. There had been so many unanswered questions, so many decisions that had been made for her, and yet no one had ever told her the full truth. Meryl had tried to move on, to believe that life had taken a different course, but this was a reality she could never have imagined. The woman stepped closer, her face full of sorrow and regret. "Meryl, we thought it was for the best. After everything that happened between you two, we thought it was safer for her to be with us. We kept her out of the public eye, away from the media. But now she's ready to meet you again. We thought it was time." Meryl shook her head, her mind reeling, her pulse pounding in her ears. She looked down at Lily, who stood there so calm, so composed, as if she were waiting for this moment to unfold. Her daughter had known all along. But for Meryl, this was a revelation that she had never been prepared for. The room seemed to close in around her. The grief of the years spent apart was like a weight in her chest, suffocating her. How could it be that this child, her child, had been living just out of reach for so long? Meryl's hands trembled as she reached out, as if trying to touch something that was no longer there. "But I didn't know," she said, her voice faltering. "I thought you were..." The woman sighed deeply, her expression full of empathy. It wasn't that simple, Meryl. There were reasons we couldn't explain before. But now the truth is here and it's all we have left. Meryl's head was spinning and for a moment the room felt too small. The emotions of the past, the anger, the loss, the confusion, swirled within her, crashing against the newfound reality she was faced with. She had never imagined that her daughter was out there, living a life she had no part in. She had always hoped that maybe the girl was safe, maybe she was happy, but this was the truth she hadn't been prepared for. Lily's gaze softened as she took a hesitant step forward, her eyes filled with an innocence that cut through Meryl's pain. "I've always known," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always known I'd find you again." Meryl felt the air leave her lungs as she looked at the girl. The words, so simple yet so powerful, seemed to break something within her. The years of separation suddenly seemed so much smaller in that moment. This was her daughter. This was the moment they had both been waiting for. But Meryl couldn't bring herself to say it. She couldn't bring herself to tell the girl that she, too, had always hoped for this day. She had no idea how to explain the ache, the longing, the guilt. All she could do was step forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to Lily. "I'm so sorry," Meryl whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she hadn't been able to say for so many years. I didn't know. Lily smiled softly, a small, knowing smile that seemed to say everything Meryl couldn't. She reached out, taking Meryl's hand with the same calm certainty, and for the first time in years, Meryl felt the weight of her daughter's presence. They were together again. Meryl's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled Lily into a tight embrace. Her arms wrapped around the girl as if she were afraid that, if she let go, the reality of this moment would slip away. Tears welled up in Meryl's eyes, and she could feel her body shaking from the force of emotions she could no longer contain. "I'm so sorry," Meryl whispered, her voice trembling. The words felt too small to capture the weight of everything she had lost, everything she had failed to understand until now. I didn't know you were out there." Lily squeezed her arms around Meryl, her small body pressed against Meryl's chest, and for the first time, Meryl felt a deep, undeniable connection, one that transcended the years of separation. "It's okay, Mom," Lily said softly, her voice filled with a calm wisdom that belied her age. "I've always known you'd find me again." Meryl closed her eyes, holding the girl tighter. The years of wondering, the pain of separation, all of it was melting away in this moment. She didn't know how or why, but somehow the girl who had been missing for so long was finally back in her arms. The world outside the cafe continued as it always did. The bustling streets of Times Square didn't stop for anyone. People hurried past, taxis honked, and the neon lights blazed above the crowd. But for Meryl and Lily, none of it mattered anymore. The chaotic energy of the city felt distant now, like background noise to a moment that would change everything. In that quiet corner of the cafe, where time seemed to slow down, Meryl realized that their lives had shifted in an instant. What had begun as a random encounter in the middle of a crowded city had turned into something far greater. A reunion neither of them had ever expected, but both had secretly hoped for. Meryl could feel the warmth of Lily's embrace, and as she pulled back just enough to look into her daughter's eyes, she saw the same familiar spark, the same trusting gaze she had once known so well. It was a bond that had never truly been broken, no matter the years that had passed. It had only been waiting to be rediscovered. "I don't know how to make up for all this time we lost," Meryl said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I promise from now on, I'm never letting you go again." Lily smiled, a soft, knowing smile that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of waiting. "We'll figure it out, Mom. We have time now." Meryl nodded, her chest swelling with a mix of relief and overwhelming love. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that neither of them had anticipated but both desperately needed. The past could never be undone, but they had the future in front of them now, together. For Meryl, this was the moment she had been waiting for her whole life. She had found her daughter, and in doing so, she had found herself again. There was no going back to the person she had been before this moment. She was forever changed. And in this new reality, she would not only be a mother, but a mother who had been given a second chance. The two of them sat there for a while, holding hands across the table, the noise of the city fading into the background as they took in the newness of the moment. There was so much to talk about, so many years to make up for. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that they were finally together. And just like that, what had started as a moment of uncertainty had blossomed into something beautiful. This was the beginning of a new life, one filled with promise, love, and the quiet comfort of knowing they had found each other again.